How about Donald Trump?
I would ask him, do you see me as a human?
Oh.
This person is going viral right now, and it's honestly sad how much their brain appears to have been broken by radical activists. We're going to break down a viral clip from MSNBC that shows just how successful some radical trans activist groups have been in brainwashing young college students, and so much more. On today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics and across the internet from an independent perspective. So the clip we're about to go over has gone mega viral across the internet, and it's from a segment that Stephanie Ruhle over on MSNBC did with seniors at Rutgers University in New Jersey, asking them about the 2024 election and their political preferences, and in particular, this one bit featuring a student, Rachel Toffler, who identifies as they, them, as non-binary, has gone mega viral. And when we watch it, you'll see why.
If I were to ask Vice President Harris a question, I think I would ask her, how soon do you think we can get the Equality Act passed?
How about Donald Trump?
I would ask him, do you see me as a human?
Oh. I'm sorry.
Is it possible to roll your eyes so hard you give yourself brain damage? Because that's honestly how this clip made me feel. I mean, millions of people across the internet were so touched by this and so taken aback and felt so emotional and say they cried hearing this young person's attitude and how much they just need a hug. And I'm just like, oh my God, give me a break. You have been so brainwashed. You're just totally delulu and out of touch with reality. I'll give you more of my in-depth analysis on what happened in this clip here in a second. But first, I want to just show you how mega viral this video went on TikTok. It had nearly 14 million views and millions of likes from adoring people who were just eating up this narrative that actually, yeah, Republicans don't think LGBTQ people are real human beings or whatever. The comments section on this was just full of people eating up this narrative that somebody would have to ask in 2024, do you see me as a human is deeply sad. Make humanity greater. Vote blue. This right here. I got you. I got you. The Equality Act will fix everyone's problems and feelings. That's number one on my list. The fact that you have to ask that question makes me cry. The fact that you stand there and make that pronouncement makes me proud. Stephanie's reaction was just as powerful. It shows how many of us feel like we are getting punched in the gut and can do nothing about it but apologize that it's happening. Actually, Stephanie Ruhle's reaction is pathetic and part of the problem. An interviewer should not affirm a delusional statement. They should probably fact check it if you're just claiming things that have no basis in reality, instead of broadcasting it on national television and then acting like your heart was just truly touched. You guys can probably hear in my voice the kind of contempt I have for this narrative, but I want to be clear, it's not necessarily contempt for this person who I'm sure is a lovely human and just seems deeply confused and appears to have been brainwashed by some pretty radical activist groups. I did some poking around about Rachel, and I found on the Rutgers website that Rachel has taken up an advocacy role, worked in LGBT rights activism, including with Senator Elizabeth Warren and with the Human Rights Campaign. Rachel is also, perhaps unsurprisingly, a student leader for the Honors College LGBTQ+ affinity group, which, guys, that's code for self-segregation among identity groups. And Rachel's ambition is to be a professional LGBT activist. I want to be working for some advocacy group as a director, as somebody who has experience in that area, Rachel said. I want to say somewhere in the human rights, working as an executive director somewhere, and then maybe in another 10 years I'll run for office. Well, Rachel, if your goal is to become a professional victim, a member of the activist class, you're off to a great start, honestly. Because this is exactly the kind of ridiculous, tiresome, emotional drivel and hyperbole that the activist groups in the LGBT community are all in on these days. And they don't really seem to care how ridiculous it is considered by most everyday Americans. Like when the Human Rights Campaign declared recently the first in their ever history since the 1980s state of emergency for LGBTQ rights, as if it's somehow worse off for LGBT rights in 2023 or 2024 than it was in 1982. So, seeing as that's the general vibe of these organizations, Rachel seems like actually a great fit. But I want to talk about the substance of this clip as well. Rachel, nobody thinks you're not a human being. That's not a thing. Now, some people disagree with your identity as non-binary. They don't think there's a third sex or gender. They don't think that simply not conforming to gender stereotypes means that you aren't a man or aren't a woman. In fact, many of us find that notion inherently sexist and regressive. But just because somebody disagrees with an aspect of your identity does not mean they don't see you as human. I mean, if you have a friend who's a Christian and you aren't a Christian, you're a militant atheist, so you disagree with an important key aspect of their identity, surely you still see them as a human being. The hysteria on display here is just totally detached from facts and from reality, and it's what happens when you incentivize people culturally to be as oppressed as possible, to identify into as many victim groups as they can, because for some bizarre reason, young people online, and especially on college campuses, have turned oppression and victimhood into a form of social currency. And this is the inevitable dysfunctional result. Also, just a quick note on the whole Equality Act thing. The Equality Act is legislation that would expand the Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics. It might sound innocuous enough, but it's actually really radical, sweeping legislation that redefines sex under federal law to mean whatever you feel like and undercuts existing protections in federal law for religious freedom. It also radically expands the definition of what counts as a public accommodation to the point where much smaller businesses and individual enterprises would suddenly be caught up in anti-discrimination laws that currently aren't applied to them. That could lead to many dysfunctional results. It could also result in doctors being forced to provide transition care against their conscience and against what they believe in, and a whole other host of horribles that many people disagree with in good faith, and not because they don't recognize your humanity. LGBT people are already protected in employment because of the Bostock Supreme Court decision, so that part of the Equality Act is basically just redundant at this point. Also, Rachel is from Massachusetts and went to college in New Jersey, and assuming that Rachel stays put in one of those states, the same protections as the Equality Act would enact are already in place in your state law. I've just seen no evidence that there's some epidemic of discrimination in housing or employment for LGBT people, especially considering that many states already have these protections at the state level. So why that's even a concern, plus Kamala's never going to have the votes to pass that, at least it doesn't seem likely, as we'll probably have a Republican Senate at least. But regardless, just why that's a top priority for you is not clear to me. But it's the second piece of this clip that is why it's gone truly viral and why I find it so deeply, deeply disturbing. Nobody is questioning your humanity or dehumanizing you just because they don't fully buy into a gender identity that nobody except people on Tumblr had heard of until a couple of years ago. This victim narrative is getting out of control, and activists have just brainwash so many of these young people into this state of hysteria and fear and alarmism that's just not justified by factual reality. That's not just bad for our society and for our political discourse, it's not good for them and their mental and emotional health. But sadly, it's kind of par for the course these days. What did you think of this viral clip and this interview segment more broadly? Let me know in the comments, and do hit that like button while you're at it. Remember, I do take the time to read the comments, and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely read it on tomorrow's show. And now, we've got to check in with the billionaire, entrepreneur, and Kamala Harris supporter, Mark Cuban, because he just got called out on live television. Take a listen to this clip from Squawk Box on CNBC.
Hey, Mark, I'm looking at an NBC article from our corporate parent that just says, I guess, at an Arizona town hall meeting, when you were asked about the possibility of taxing unrealized capital gains, you said if you really thought that the vice president would do that you'd campaign against her. So I guess that was a true comment you made. And then my follow-up
So what
question.
I said was,
go on.
I said it's not going to happen. Absolutely not going to happen. If for some reason she lied about it, I would campaign against her so there wouldn't be a second term.
What on earth? Guys, I got nothing against Mark Cuban. I've always liked him on Shark Tank, and he seems like a smart businessman. But politically, I have some questions about what this man is smoking. They're talking about a tax on unrealized capital gains. Basically, a tax on the increased value of stocks or assets that have increased in value that you haven't sold yet. Right now, there's only a tax on capital gains. Once you sell the stock or the asset, you get taxed on how much money you made on it. But a very fringe left-wing idea, economically speaking, is to tax the unrealized gains before you even cash them out, before you even have any income from the asset, to try to grab more money from the rich to fund more redistribution or welfare or whatever. This idea is really controversial and arguably unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't authorize that kind of a wealth tax. And many businessmen and entrepreneurs warn that it would have hugely detrimental economic impacts on the stock market. Plus, there's the concern that it would warp incentives and discourage people from making these kinds of investments and instead lead them to just cash out their assets early. And there's huge implementation questions about when they would be taxed on this asset. Would they get a massive refund if the asset goes back down? How would this be enforced? There's so many layers of complexity and dysfunction that would follow such a system. So understandably, many people are very concerned by the fact that Kamala Harris has endorsed this idea. It was part of Joe Biden's tax plan, which Kamala says she fully supports. But Mark Cuban is on TV saying, no, she doesn't really support that. And if she was lying about not supporting it, but she said she does support it, so what you're saying doesn't make sense, Mark, then I'd campaign against her and there wouldn't be a second term. Which, side note, is kind of arrogant. As if, if Mark Cuban changed his support, she'd never get reelected. Babe, you're rich, but I don't think you're that important, okay? You wouldn't decide a whole election just based on your endorsement. Anyway, I just found it so bizarre how he's saying he would totally flip in his support for Kamala and even campaign against her if she supported this thing that Kamala currently says she supports. The math is not mathing. And guys, you don't have to take my word for this. As the host mentioned, NBC News, that conservative news outlet, has pointed out this weird double standard. The headline is really something. Mark Cuban speaks out against piece of Harris's tax plan while campaigning for her. The vice president in August endorsed Joe Biden's 2025 budget, which included a plan to tax unrealized gains for the highest earners in the U.S. They report from Phoenix, Arizona, that the billionaire entrepreneur Mark Cuban said while campaigning for Vice President Kamala Harris that he would campaign against her if he thought she would tax wealthy people's unrealized gains, which is part of the tax plan she has endorsed. Cuban said that taxing capital gains would be an economy killer, and Kamala knows that. So, Mark Cuban thinks a tax on unrealized capital gains is an economy killer, which I agree with him. I think he's correct. But he's supporting Kamala even though she's endorsed that policy. The best case scenario, what he's saying here is, don't worry guys, Kamala's just a liar. She's not going to actually do the things she says she supports and is going to do, which is not the endorsement you think it is, Mark. And the more likely scenario is that she actually does plan to do the thing she says she's going to do, and she might have given you quiet reassurances behind the scenes. She's just playing you for a fool to get your money and get your support. Either way, it was really interesting to me to see Mark Cuban checked on this in real time on live TV. What do you think? Do you support taxing unrealized capital gains? And how do you feel about Mark Cuban these days? Because his support for Kamala has definitely changed the way I look at him, although I do still respect him as a businessman. Let me know in the comments below. And now it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my daily segment where I take on the craziest ideas from the Clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slugs.
Today, we're catching up with one of the most hated people on all of TikTok, Jeffrey Marsh, who's back with a disturbing, intolerant, and insane message for people out there who have family members who support Trump. Let's take a listen, and guys, jump scare warning.
Hi, should you cut off contact with family members just because they are voting for Donald Trump? Yes.
Oh?
If so far they have not been able or willing to listen to compassion, to listen to kindness, to listen to you, or even to do their own research and discover that hatred's not the answer, that love and kindness is the answer. If they are unwilling to change, they must experience consequences. And you should not withhold those consequences from them. The consequence in this case would be they don't get your beautiful, loving, wonderful presence in their lives. It's over. And they are gone. You need to make it real for yourself.
Ugh. I hate it here. Now, the comment section on this did eat Jeffrey up. And while I don't support the mean comments, some of them did make me chuckle a little bit. One person said, "Should you cut off contact with your hairdresser?" The answer is yes. Another person wrote, "It puts the lotion on the skin" vibes. Another person wrote, "Family's more important than politics, at least to me. Amen." Another person said, "So much for compassion and peace and open-mindedness." Yep. Where did that go? Now, I have to say, this is a little bit personal for me, how much this video and this message truly bothers me, because you guys might not know this, but I became estranged from my dad in 2016. And so, wow, nearly 10 years. So I have no father in my life. I have no dad. We had a really toxic relationship. I was abused by my stepmother for years while he just watched and did nothing. And that's something that really makes me sad. That's this empty space in my life where, you know, I have a great stepfather. I have a cool father-in-law who I've really gotten to know. I mean, we're not technically married, but you know what I mean? It's like the same thing. But while I don't think it really affects me a ton these days, it was a really hard and sad thing for me not to have a father in my life. The idea that somebody would have a meaningful and positive relationship with a parent, but simply throw it away because they don't like how that person votes, is not just fucking insane to me. It's actually insulting to so many people who have lost their parents, who don't have a parent, who are estranged from their parent, or what have you, who would kill to have a parent in their life who loves them and wouldn't give a shit who they check off at the ballot box once every 2 to 4 years. It really does make me angry to see somebody casting away family members for such an inane reason, and let alone doing it yourself in your own life is bad enough. Going on the internet and encouraging other people, trying to advocate to break up people's families, that's just demented. Like, that's sick. Wherever that's coming from is probably some personal damage or trauma or whatever, but it's just a sick way to spend your time and to use your capital you have as a social media influencer. There's also something so creepy and controlling about this, threatening adults with consequences. Like, these aren't children, these aren't toddlers, and you don't have the right to control them and how they think or who they support politically. You get to decide who you vote for. You get to make up your own mind. You don't get to control other people's minds and make their minds up for them. That's actually not how a healthy relationship between adults works. Imagine the inverse, and I actually know people, because I'm out here in West Michigan where there's very Christian, Republican, rural communities. I actually know people who grew up in that kind of community and have become more liberal, and their parents have threatened them or threatened to cut them off if they vote for Kamala or if they voted for Biden in 2020. I think that's crazy. I think that's intolerant. It's closed-minded. No one person's vote really makes anything of a difference. And I'm sure if Jeffrey was presented with that kind of scenario, Jeffrey would say that's psycho behavior. And you know what? I would agree. Jeffrey would say that's abusive behavior. And you know what? I would agree. But you can't have it both ways. You can't oppose that kind of thing, then think it's fine to do it in the opposite direction. Well, I guess you can, but it makes you a total hypocrite. And Jeffrey's view of politics, as if these complex issues that divide us are really so simple that it's just kindness and compassion versus hatred. Give me a break. You are vastly oversimplifying the issues facing this country, and the fact that many of them are complicated and nuanced and serious, and good people of good faith can come down on either side on many of these complex questions that divide us. Plus, even if you are a Kamala supporter, you are a liberal, and your goal is to convince your stupid MAGA parents or whatever you look at them as, cutting them off is not the way to do that. You have a much better chance of changing their views, or at least moderating them somewhat, by maintaining a relationship and sharing different perspectives, sharing with them information that they won't see in their echo chambers, asking them questions that make them think critically about some of the things they're believing or accepting. But you can't do any of that if you just cut them off because they dare disagree with you and your infinite wisdom, Jeffrey Marsh. You know, guys, I try not to let these videos work me up, but this one really bothered me. And of course, Jeffrey wanted to play the victim because Jeffrey got a few mean comments on this. And so Jeffrey put out another video taking some random comment who said Jeffrey looked like the clown from It and saying that all Republicans are evil. Yeah. Take a listen to this follow-up.
When you look at me, do you see a human being? The right wants to unhuman us. They want to accuse us. They want to say the worst, awful things about trans folks so that we are unhuman, so that we're shameful, disgusting. And once we are unhuman to them, that means they can morally make sense of doing anything they want to us, putting our lives in danger, passing laws against us. And to put it in political terms, if you look at me and see a human being, you are a Democrat. If you look at me and see evil, disgusting, subhuman, unhuman, different and less, you are a Republican. And I really wish it was not that way.
See, I don't think this video landed the way that Jeffrey hoped it would, because I bet you a lot of people saw this video and were like, guess I'm a Republican now. To be clear, of course I view Jeffrey as a human being, not as subhuman or any of that, not at all. But what I do view Jeffrey as is a human whose advocacy is evil and disturbing and terrible in many ways, from trying to destroy people's families and have them cut off their parents over differences of opinion to very questionable behaviors on Jeffrey's Patreon. You can go look that up if you're interested in that story. It's so frustrating to see somebody like Jeffrey so blatantly use their identity and their victim script as shield from legitimate criticism. Yes, some people were mean, saying Jeffrey looked like the clown from It. I don't support mean behavior. I shouldn't even be laughing, but I don't support that. But there's plenty of valid criticisms being made, and your deflection and defense is just, everyone thinks I'm subhuman and they're just all hateful bigots towards trans people, which Jeffrey isn't even trans. Jeffrey is non-binary, which is not transgender or transsexual in any meaningful sense of the word. In fact, people like Blair White very specifically argue that non-binary should not be considered trans. So I don't even buy that to begin with. But regardless, the fact that some people are being mean to you doesn't mean there aren't plenty of legitimate criticisms, or that everybody who's a Republican just hates you because of your identity. No, they hate you because of the crazy things you're saying online and the terrible advice you're giving impressionable young people on TikTok. So maybe, Jeffrey, for 5 seconds, you could stop playing the victim and consider that maybe, just maybe, some of your critics actually have a point. But what did you guys think of these Jeffrey Marsh videos and of Jeffrey more broadly? Do let me know in the comments below, and do hit that like button to reward my suffering through this really disturbing stuff. And now, I'll wrap up today's video by reading a few of your comments from yesterday's episode. One person writes, I'm an instructional assistant, similar to a TA, and I would never talk to a kindergarten student about adult topics like gender. I only help with their ABCs, writing, etc. Good for you. This is in reference to that TikTok video of that kindergarten TA who told their kids about non-binary and trans in kindergarten class. Good for you. I know that most people out there are still sane, and I have a lot of respect for teachers and the people that work in the education system. And I understand that not all of y'all are like these crazies on TikTok. In fact, one of the biggest problems with them is they're giving you all such a bad name. It's really not fair. But that's also how I feel as a gay person or a LGBT person as well. They are giving us all a bad name with the dumbass stuff they're doing and just showing their ass on the internet. Another person writes, what I found out about Adam Smith Connor was that he was convicted of violating a zoning ordinance put in place to prevent protesting at the abortion clinic. People were gathering and protesting abortion, including by holding silent vigils for the unborn. There was a public hearing process in which this was essentially determined to be intimidation and or shaming of people seeking services at the clinic. Essentially, there is a buffer zone around the clinic for 3 years that people cannot protest within. So he wasn't fined for praying, he was fined for violating the ordinance. It actually appears he may have been deliberately seeking to be fined so this narrative could be promoted. I understand your point, and I talked about this in the article I wrote about this subject, actually. But yeah, just because there was an ordinance doesn't mean he wasn't fined for praying. The ordinance prohibits him from praying, and that's the law that he was cited under to criminalize him praying. And I understand that there's a buffer zone. I don't believe in that. That's declaring spaces outside of the actual property of the abortion clinic a free speech zone, a no-go zone for freedom of thought and religion. That's not something that should exist in a free society. And of course, I don't want people to be harassed while they're entering an abortion clinic, but off the property, other people have a right to speak and pray and think and advocate. And that's just the price of a free society. It's the same right that protects the rights of pro-choicers or abortion advocates as well to go into other settings and advocate for their ideas. So I understand that there's an ordinance, but I think that ordinance is unjust and censorious. Another person writes, I knew there was no freedom of speech in Great Britain, but thought that's beyond insane. Yeah, I really do find it disturbing that we're moving into the direction of not just punishing people for speech, which they've been doing for a long time in England, and it's dystopian enough, but now silent actions can get you in trouble. It's honestly insane. Another person writes, convicted of praying, but they refuse to arrest shoplifters. Someone needs to get their heads out of their asses and convict the real criminals. Yeah, I don't know if that's a problem in the UK or if they do crack down on shoplifters. I'm not familiar with that. But I will say here, the places where they've stopped enforcing shoplifting laws, I find that so insane and harmful and counterproductive and just a total dereliction of one of the only actual important things the government is supposed to do, which is upholding the rule of law and protecting property rights and all that. But of course, in places like California, they're really failing at that. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please do make sure to subscribe if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button before you go and do comment with your thoughts. I love reading the comments and hearing what you all have to say. And I do pick a few to reply to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely respond to it on tomorrow's show. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.